The evening rush was in full swing at the prestigious La Lumiere, a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of downtown. The kitchen was buzzing with activity, the sound of sizzling pans and the clattering of silverware filling the air. The soft hum of quiet conversations from the well-dressed patrons created an atmosphere of luxury. The lighting was dim, the tables set with meticulous care, and the wine list was as refined as the people who frequented it. Brad, the restaurant's manager, had seen it all. He had worked his way up from being a waiter to the man in charge of ensuring that everything ran like clockwork. His reputation for being no-nonsense had earned him respect from the staff, though not much affection. His razor-sharp focus on perfection often made him seem cold and aloof. It had been one of those nights, packed with VIPs, celebrity clients, and the usual crowd of wealthy regulars who expected the very best. Brad was already running behind, juggling multiple problems: a broken bottle of champagne, a late reservation, and a disgruntled guest who wasn't happy with his table placement. His stress was palpable. And then, a man walked in. Keanu Reeves. Brad didn't recognize him at first. The actor was trying to keep a low profile, as he often did, avoiding attention from the crowd around him. He was dressed casually, in jeans and a leather jacket, his sunglasses perched on his face despite the indoor setting. To most, he was just another celebrity who didn't want to be bothered. But Brad, too busy managing the chaos, didn't think twice about the man's identity. He had a reputation to uphold and a job to do. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Brad asked, his tone brisk, scanning the list in front of him without a hint of recognition. The man smiled politely, his voice calm and pleasant. "No reservation, just hoping to get a table." Brad glanced at the guest list. The place was packed. "I'm afraid we're fully booked for the evening," Brad said, his voice becoming slightly more dismissive. "You'll have to wait for a table." Keanu nodded, not reacting. "It's fine. I don't mind waiting." But Brad, focused on the growing line of frustrated guests, didn't have the patience for such things. "I'm sorry, but there's not much I can do. Maybe try somewhere else." Keanu's face remained neutral, but his patience was clearly running thin. "Actually, I'm Keanu Reeves." Brad didn't even blink. The name didn't register in his mind. He was too far gone in his stress to pay attention to the subtlety in Keanu's voice. "Listen, I understand you're trying to get special treatment, but we're doing our best here. You'll have to wait like everyone else." Keanu stood there, a slight sigh escaping his lips, but his demeanor remained composed. "I'm happy to wait," he said again, though this time there was a certain calmness in his tone that suggested he was no longer interested in pursuing the conversation further. Brad's attention shifted immediately to another table that needed his immediate attention, his words dismissing Keanu for the last time. "Good luck," he muttered, already walking away. Keanu didn't move. He didn't protest. He simply turned and walked out of the restaurant. The moment was quickly forgotten in the flurry of Brad's duties. He continued to manage the floor, his mind distracted by the increasing pressure to keep things running smoothly. It wasn't until later, when Brad overheard a conversation between two waitstaff, that the name Keanu Reeves hit him like a ton of bricks. "Did you hear that?" one of the servers said. "The guy Brad kicked out? That was Keanu Reeves." Brad stopped in his tracks, his stomach sinking as realization began to settle in. He had just dismissed one of the most famous actors in the world, and not only had he done it with no remorse, but he had done it with such arrogance that it made him look like a fool. A pit formed in his stomach as he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. And little did he know, the ripple effects of this mistake were just beginning. Brad glanced around the room, as if expecting the walls to close in on him. But no one had noticed, at least not yet. No one but the staff. And soon, the whole city would know. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. The video at the front of the restaurant blared. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Brad didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn the hard way what happens when you dismiss the wrong person. The consequences of his actions would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't have imagined. Brad sat in his small office behind the kitchen, his mind racing. His fingers drummed nervously on the desk, as he tried to push the memory of the earlier encounter with Keanu out of his head. He had a restaurant to run, after all. But it wasn't just the night's events that had him on edge. There was something deeper, something gnawing at him, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. In his 30s, Brad had always been the type of person who would push others out of his way to get what he wanted. It wasn't personal. It was just the way things were. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, he had learned early on that life didn't hand you anything. You had to take it. The more aggressive, the better. His rise through the ranks of La Lumiere hadn't been by chance. Brad had worked tirelessly, never taking no for an answer. He started as a dishwasher in the kitchen, scraping plates while dreaming of a better life. It wasn't long before he made his way to serving, and then to managing. His ambition was relentless, but so was his need to control everything around him. As he climbed the ladder, Brad quickly learned how to deal with people, how to manipulate situations in his favor. He became known as the manager who could make things happen, no matter the cost. He was tough, unyielding, and rarely made exceptions. But there was a problem. People didn't like him. Sure, they respected him because of his position, but there was always that thin layer of tension in the air whenever Brad was around. He wasn't warm. He wasn't kind. He was a manager who demanded perfection, and if that came at the cost of human decency, so be it. Brad's colleagues didn't hesitate to gossip about his cold demeanor. They knew he could be ruthless, but few realized the pressure he was under. Running a high-end restaurant like La Lumiere wasn't easy. The expectations were sky-high, and every mistake felt like it could be his last. There was no room for error, no patience for imperfections. But despite his exterior, Brad had his own insecurities. He wasn't as confident as he made himself seem. Deep down, he feared that all of this, his career, his position, his life, could come crashing down at any moment. The truth was, he often felt like an imposter, pretending to be someone who had it all figured out. The constant need to be perfect, to appear flawless in front of others, was exhausting. He built up walls around himself, distancing himself from any vulnerability or empathy. He thought of his own family. His parents had always been distant, focused on their own careers and ambitions, leaving him to fend for himself. He had grown up in a cold, competitive environment where feelings didn't matter and achievements were everything. He learned to keep his emotions locked away, a trait that followed him into adulthood. In relationships, Brad never allowed anyone to get too close. He didn't want to be vulnerable. There had been a few women in his life, casual dates and short flings, but nothing that lasted. He was too focused on climbing the ladder to ever stop and smell the roses. Love wasn't something he had time for. His colleagues respected him, sure, but they didn't love him, and he didn't care. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But tonight, something had shifted. That calm, collected man who had walked into his restaurant, Keanu Reeves, had somehow gotten under his skin. The way he had handled the situation with such grace, without raising his voice or causing a scene, made Brad feel small. For the first time in a long while, Brad was reminded that there was more to life than just work, and that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invincible as he thought. As Brad sat in his office, the weight of his earlier actions sank in. He replayed the scene over and over in his head. He had dismissed Keanu without a second thought, treating him like just another nobody. It wasn't like Brad to make such a mistake. He prided himself on being able to handle any situation with control and precision. But this time, he had crossed a line. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through the staff group chat. The news of Keanu's visit had already spread like wildfire. The staff were buzzing with excitement. Some were even joking about the incident, making light of how their boss had blown it with a major celebrity. Brad's stomach churned. He knew he had to make things right. But how? The phone buzzed in his hand, a message from his assistant manager, Jessica. "Brad, did you hear? The guest you dismissed earlier? That was Keanu Reeves, the one who was trying to get in without a reservation. I'm hearing all sorts of rumors." Brad stared at the message for a moment, his pulse quickening. He had already guessed it, but seeing it in black and white made it real. He had messed up. Badly. His mind raced, but there was no time to dwell on it now. The night was still far from over, and the restaurant had more pressing concerns than an actor who had walked out in frustration. But as the hours passed, Brad found himself distracted, unable to focus. All he could think about was the man he had so casually dismissed. Keanu was known for being humble, kind, and down-to-earth, exactly the opposite of Brad. The more he thought about it, the more Brad realized how badly he had misjudged the situation. Keanu hadn't been looking for special treatment. He had simply wanted to enjoy a meal in peace. Brad's response had been unnecessarily rude. And now, the consequences of that mistake were unfolding in front of him. His arrogance had led him to treat a man who deserved respect as just another celebrity looking for perks. What would happen when the word spread further? Would the restaurant's reputation suffer because of his carelessness? The evening dragged on, but Brad couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was on the horizon, something he wouldn't be able to control. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Brad. His mind was racing, but he had to keep up appearances. The restaurant was full. The staff were scrambling to make sure each customer was happy, and he was right there in the thick of it, overseeing it all. But every few minutes, he found himself distracted by the thought of what had happened with Keanu Reeves. Word had already spread through the kitchen and among the waitstaff. A few of the younger servers were talking excitedly about the encounter, each of them trying to one-up the other with their version of events. They had no idea how much damage had already been done. Brad wasn't concerned about a few offhand comments among the staff. No, the ripple effect of his actions was much larger. Keanu Reeves was no ordinary celebrity. He wasn't just another face in a crowd of rich, famous, or influential people. He was a household name, an actor whose every move was followed by millions. His films had touched people across generations, and he was known not just for his performances but for his down-to-earth nature. If he wanted to, he could make a phone call and have Brad's reputation in tatters within hours. That thought gnawed at Brad. Around 9:30 p.m., the phone in his office buzzed again, interrupting his deepening sense of dread. He picked it up, hoping for a distraction. "Brad, you need to see this," Jessica's text read. Keanu posted something on his Instagram. Brad's stomach sank. He quickly opened the app on his phone, his fingers trembling. He had seen how quickly things could spiral on social media, especially when it involved high-profile celebrities like Keanu. The post was a selfie, Keanu smiling casually at the camera, but the caption made Brad's heart drop into his stomach. A quick night out turned into an unexpected journey. #adventure waits, #thank you for your hospitality. There was no mention of La Lumiere specifically, but the #thank you for your hospitality was impossible to ignore. And as the post began to accumulate likes and comments, Brad could feel his world starting to tilt. Jessica was right. He had underestimated the power of social media and how a simple encounter with Keanu could snowball into something much bigger. Brad quickly scrolled through the comments, and there were a lot of them. Some were harmless, fans complimenting Keanu's cool, collected demeanor. But others were beginning to question the experience he had in the restaurant. "Didn't you get kicked out? I saw you in the lobby. What happened?" one comment read. As the post gained traction, Brad realized just how much trouble he was in. People were talking. This was no longer just about a mistake made in the heat of the moment. This was now a public relations nightmare. He stared at his phone for what felt like an eternity, wondering what to do next. There was no denying it. His actions had made their way into the public eye. The truth was, Brad had never been prepared for this kind of fallout. He was a man who thrived behind the scenes, managing chaos with quiet authority. But now, there was no hiding from it. His first instinct was to ignore it. Just let the noise die down, he thought. Celebrities were always posting random thoughts on social media, and tomorrow, it would probably be forgotten. But that wasn't the case. As the night wore on, the comments kept pouring in, the buzz on Twitter and Instagram growing louder. Brad knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. If he didn't act fast, the restaurant's reputation, and by extension, his own, could be at risk. By the time his shift ended, Brad was exhausted. The evening had been draining enough without the added stress of trying to ignore the fallout from his mistake. But as he walked out of La Lumiere, his mind kept racing, the thought of what might happen next growing ever more impossible to shake. The following morning, Brad woke to a deluge of emails from the restaurant's PR team. It was like a storm had hit. The headlines had already begun to emerge. Manager of luxury restaurant dismisses Hollywood icon Keanu Reeves. Ignites backlash. Keanu Reeves blasted by manager at La Lumiere. No special treatment here. Brad's hands trembled as he scrolled through the articles, each one building on the last. It wasn't just the fans now. News outlets were picking up the story. His phone was ringing off the hook, with journalists and bloggers all eager to get his side of the story. Some wanted a comment, others demanded an apology. Brad had never been so overwhelmed in his life. He was used to dealing with unhappy customers, but this was something completely different. He couldn't just brush it off. This wasn't just another disgruntled guest. It was Keanu Reeves. His mind raced as he paced around his apartment, trying to formulate a response. Should he apologize? Should he issue a statement? Or would that make things worse? The more he thought about it, the more the pressure mounted. The reputation of La Lumiere, and perhaps even his career, was on the line. Later that afternoon, after hours of debating with himself, Brad decided to take action. He called Jessica into his office. "I need to fix this," Brad said, his voice strained. "We need to issue a public apology, not just to Keanu, but to the entire city. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a major screw-up." Jessica nodded, her eyes wide with concern. "Brad, do you think that'll be enough? He's Keanu Reeves. If we don't handle this the right way, it could blow up even more." Brad didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let this mistake define him. He would have to face the music, and fast. "What else can we do?" he asked, his voice low. "I've already messed up. All I can do now is own up to it." Jessica hesitated before speaking again. "We'll have to make sure we do this right, Brad. The longer you wait, the worse it could get." Brad took a deep breath. The storm wasn't over, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But one thing was certain. He had a lot of work ahead of him if he wanted to fix this. Brad barely slept the night before. The weight of his actions, the pressure from the media, and the looming sense of inevitable consequences had kept him up, tossing and turning. By the time morning came, his usual sharp focus had been replaced by a dull anxiety he couldn't shake. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. He wasn't used to this kind of pressure. At 9 a.m., the PR team arrived at La Lumiere for an emergency meeting. They had set up an impromptu conference room in one of the private dining areas, the place that was usually reserved for special guests. Today, it was all business. "Brad, we need to move fast," said Karen, the head of the PR team, as soon as he entered the room. She was in her late 40s, sharp, efficient, and always on top of things. Normally, Brad would have admired her for that, but today, he only felt the weight of her judgment. "I know. What's the plan?" he asked, his voice tight. "We need to release a statement as soon as possible, and it has to be sincere, no excuses. The longer you wait, the worse it'll get. We'll also need to reach out directly to Keanu's team. He's got a reputation for being gracious, but he won't tolerate being disrespected," Karen said, laying out the details with precision. Brad swallowed hard. He had seen the damage an apology could do in the wrong hands, but at this point, he didn't have a choice. He had to make things right. "We'll write up a formal statement, but I think you need to handle it personally. Get in front of the cameras. Own it. That's the only way to salvage your credibility." Brad nodded. "I'll do it. What should I say?" Karen paused, a knowing look in her eyes. "You need to show humility, Brad. Apologize, and don't make excuses. Acknowledge your mistake and express genuine regret for the way things went down. This is about showing the world you're willing to learn from this." He exhaled deeply. It wasn't an easy thing for Brad to do. Admitting he was wrong, especially when his career had been built on the idea that he was always in control, felt like the hardest thing he'd ever had to face. "But you need to mean it, Brad. This is your chance to show people who you really are, not just the manager who runs a restaurant," Karen added, before walking out of the room to finalize the press release. Brad remained standing by the large windows, staring out at the busy streets of the city. The view from La Lumiere's private dining room always had a way of making him feel powerful, like he was above it all. But now, it only served as a reminder of what he stood to lose. He thought back to Keanu's calm, almost detached demeanor from the night before. That man, who had every reason to be angry, chose to walk away with grace. And Brad? He had let his pride get the best of him. In a split second, he had made a judgment that would affect not only his future but the future of La Lumiere as well. He knew that this wasn't just about saving face. It was about repairing a broken relationship and learning from the experience. Keanu wasn't just another guest, another name in a list of high-profile diners. He was someone who had earned the respect of millions, and Brad had failed to acknowledge that. Taking a deep breath, Brad sat at the table and began to write. Press Statement Draft. I would like to extend my sincerest apologies to Keanu Reeves for my actions last night at La Lumiere. In my role as manager, I'm responsible for creating an atmosphere where all of our guests feel welcomed and valued. Unfortunately, my judgment fell short, and I deeply regret the way I treated Mr. Reeves. Mr. Reeves is a beloved figure, and it was an honor to have him as our guest. My response to him was unprofessional, and I take full responsibility for that. I will learn from this mistake and work to ensure that something like this never happens again. At La Lumiere, we strive to treat every guest with the utmost respect, and we will continue to improve our service in order to reflect that value. To Mr. Reeves, I offer my most heartfelt apology. I hope we can move forward and that you know that my actions do not reflect the standards we uphold at La Lumiere. Thank you. Brad stared at the screen for several moments, reading and rereading the words. It wasn't easy to admit he had made a mistake, but it was the truth. And if he wanted to make amends, he couldn't hide from it. Ready to go? Karen asked, walking back into the room. Brad nodded, standing up and straightening his tie. Yeah, let's do this. He wasn't sure what would come next. Would Keanu accept the apology? Would the public forgive him? There was no way of knowing. But there was one thing Brad was certain of. The only way forward was to face the music and own his actions. The press statement was released later that afternoon. The restaurant's social media pages were flooded with comments, some positive, some critical. But no matter the response, Brad knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. His actions had already caused a ripple effect, and now, it was time to see how far that ripple would spread. Hours later, Brad received a call from his assistant manager, Jessica. Brad, you're not going to believe this, she said. Keanu's team just called. Brad's heart skipped a beat. What did they say? They want to meet with you. Keanu's actually going to give you a chance to apologize in person, Jessica said, her voice almost in disbelief. Brad leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness flood over him. This was his chance to make things right, to prove that he was more than the manager of a high-end restaurant. But there was no turning back now. Whatever happened next would be the moment that defined him, and he knew he had to be ready. The call from Jessica had left Brad stunned. Keanu Reeves was giving him a chance to apologize in person? It was almost too good to be true. For the first time since the incident, a small spark of hope flickered in Brad's chest. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the road for him, or La Lumiere. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. the next day, at a small, discreet cafe near the restaurant. Brad had been told to arrive early, and he did so, arriving 5 minutes before the appointed time, his heart pounding in his chest. The cafe was quiet, with only a few patrons sipping their coffee in the corner. Brad spotted a man in a hoodie sitting by the window, his face partially obscured by a pair of sunglasses. Keanu. Brad took a deep breath and walked over, the air around him thick with anticipation. He pulled out the chair across from Keanu and sat down, trying to act casual, though his palms were sweating. Mr. Reeves, Brad began, his voice unsteady but genuine, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know I've made a huge mistake, and I wanted to offer my sincerest apology. Keanu nodded, removing his sunglasses and placing them on the table. His eyes were calm, his expression neutral but not unkind. I appreciate you taking the time to come here, Brad. It's not often people admit when they're wrong, especially in my world. Brad swallowed hard. I was unprofessional. You didn't deserve that treatment. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was completely out of line. Keanu smiled softly, his tone surprisingly gentle. Look, I'm not one to hold grudges. I've had my share of misunderstandings with people. But the way you handled the situation, it was like you saw me as just another customer. You didn't see the person. Brad nodded, his guilt intensifying. I know. I'm sorry. I was caught up in my own stress, my own arrogance. But I'm trying to learn from this. I want to be better. Keanu's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was a silence between them. It wasn't awkward, though. It felt like two people having a conversation about life. No barriers, no masks. I'm not here to make you feel worse, Brad, Keanu said. I understand that we all mess up. What matters is what you do next, how you move forward from here. That's what tells me if you've really learned anything. Brad let the words sink in. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about change. It was about Brad becoming someone better, someone who treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were a billionaire, a movie star, or a struggling waitress. Thank you, Brad said, his voice sincere. I know I've got a lot to make up for, and if I have the chance, I'd like to prove that I'm not just the guy who made a mistake. I want to be the guy who learned from it. Keanu's smile deepened. You've got that chance. All you have to do is keep showing up, doing the right thing. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Brad's heart lifted just a little bit more. For the first time in days, he felt like maybe he could redeem himself. Maybe this mistake didn't have to define him. So, what's next? Brad asked, his tone more hopeful now. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Next? Well, I think it's time to show everyone that you really do mean what you're saying. Do something that makes people see who you are, not just as a manager, but as a person. Brad thought for a moment. You're right. I've been hiding behind my role, focusing too much on control and power. It's time to show that I'm more than that. I'll take responsibility for what happened, and then I'll show the world I can be better. Keanu nodded. That's all anyone can ask for. Good luck, Brad. They both stood up, and Keanu extended his hand. Brad shook it firmly, feeling a sense of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. This was more than just an apology. It was a turning point. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Brad's apology was received well by most of the public, and the media buzz slowly began to fade. However, Brad knew that a simple apology wouldn't be enough to rebuild his reputation. He needed to do something big, something that would show people that he was truly committed to change. La Lumiere's grand reopening was just around the corner, and Brad saw this as the perfect opportunity. He called Karen and the PR team to his office. We're going to make the reopening special, Brad said, his voice steady and determined. We're going to do it right this time. No more shortcuts. We'll invite the local community, the critics, the regulars. This isn't just about food. It's about rebuilding trust. Karen raised an eyebrow. Brad, that's a huge undertaking. Are you sure you're ready for it? I have to be, Brad replied, his eyes burning with conviction. This is my chance to show everyone that I'm not just a manager who made a mistake. I'm someone who learned from it and who's committed to doing better. The PR team worked tirelessly over the next week, coordinating every detail of the reopening. They sent out invitations to influencers, top-tier critics, and key figures in the city. Brad wanted to make sure that this event wasn't just another night. It had to be a statement. When the night of the reopening finally arrived, Brad felt a mix of nerves and excitement. The restaurant was packed, the atmosphere was electric, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of calm. Everything was in place, and it was time to face the world again. As the evening unfolded, Brad moved from table to table, speaking with guests, greeting familiar faces, and ensuring that everything was running smoothly. But the real test was still ahead of him. Around 9 p.m., he saw Keanu walking into the restaurant, flanked by a few friends. The moment their eyes met, Brad's heart skipped a beat. Keanu gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement that everything had come full circle. Brad didn't need to say anything. The look in Keanu's eyes said it all. This was about redemption, and Brad had taken the first step. As the night went on, Brad knew one thing for sure. He had learned more than he ever expected. He wasn't the same person who had made that arrogant, hasty decision a week ago. He had earned a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. The night of La Lumiere's grand reopening was a critical point in Brad's journey. As the dinner service continued, he moved through the restaurant with a new sense of purpose, a commitment to humility and service that had been missing in his past. The air was thick with anticipation. The media buzz surrounding the event, the crowd of top-tier critics, and the presence of Keanu Reeves himself made this the ultimate test of Brad's resolve. Keanu, along with his friends, sat at a prime table in the middle of the dining room, the kind of seat that normally felt reserved for VIPs, but tonight, it was a symbol of how far Brad had come. He glanced over at Keanu a few times throughout the evening, hoping to catch his eye, to show him that his apology wasn't just words. It was a promise that he was changing, that La Lumiere would no longer be a place of arrogance but of genuine hospitality. Brad had worked tirelessly over the past few days to ensure everything went flawlessly. But no matter how much preparation he put in, the reality of facing Keanu, someone he had wronged in such a public way, was overwhelming. Brad's mind raced as he walked around the dining room, checking with the kitchen, ensuring the dishes were perfect, and interacting with his staff. Still, a small part of him couldn't shake the weight of his mistake. How would Keanu respond? Was this really the beginning of a new chapter? At around 10:30 p.m., as dessert was being served, Brad finally made his way over to Keanu's table. He'd been planning this moment in his mind for days, but now that it was here, his nerves were threatening to get the best of him. Keanu looked up and met his gaze with the same calm, steady expression he'd worn during their last meeting. "Keanu," Brad said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude, "I wanted to personally thank you again for giving me the chance to apologize. I know it's been a long road, but I want you to know that I'm committed to making things right, both for you and for this restaurant." Keanu took a slow sip of his wine, then set the glass down with a quiet nod. "I know you're trying, Brad, and that's all anyone can really ask for. We all have moments where we mess up. What matters is how we move forward." Brad's heart lifted at Keanu's words. There was no judgment, no malice in his voice, just a deep understanding that Brad had been through something difficult and was doing his best to grow from it. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was progress. "I know that what happened at La Lumiere wasn't just about a mistake with a customer. It was about how I let my own arrogance cloud my judgment," Brad continued, trying to keep his voice calm. "You were right to walk away, and I respect that." Keanu gave him a small smile, something soft but genuine. "We all have our moments. It's good to see you own up to it, Brad. That's the first step toward doing better." The moment felt like a turning point in Brad's life. For the first time in ages, he felt like he wasn't just managing a restaurant. He was learning from it. This wasn't about regaining the respect of one high-profile celebrity. It was about earning the respect of everyone who walked through the doors of La Lumiere. Brad stood there for a few moments, unsure of what else to say. The whole evening had felt surreal, and this conversation, in particular, felt like the closure he so desperately needed. Keanu hadn't only given him the chance to redeem himself, he had given him perspective. After a brief silence, Keanu spoke again, his voice calm but with a hint of warmth. "You've got a good thing here, Brad. Don't forget that. It's about how you treat people, how you make them feel, not just the food or the ambience." Brad nodded, a realization dawning on him. Keanu wasn't just teaching him about humility. He was teaching him about the deeper purpose of his work. This wasn't just about running a successful business. It was about creating a space where people felt valued, seen, and respected. As he walked away from Keanu's table, Brad couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude wash over him. The path forward was clear, but it would take time, hard work, and a continual commitment to the values he now understood. The reopening of La Lumiere wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Brad worked tirelessly to apply the lessons he had learned. He made sure every staff member was on the same page, fostering an atmosphere of kindness and respect. The reviews for the reopening were glowing, not just because of the exquisite food, but because of the clear shift in La Lumiere's atmosphere. But what really struck Brad was the shift in himself. The arrogance that had once defined his leadership began to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a leader. Not just someone who gave orders, but someone who inspired through action. Keanu's words stayed with him as the days turned into weeks. He wasn't just trying to salvage his career. He was trying to build something lasting. And that something wasn't about fine dining or Michelin stars. It was about creating a place where everyone felt respected, valued, and welcomed. One evening, a few months later, Brad received a letter. It was from Keanu. "Dear Brad, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the changes I've seen at La Lumiere since our conversation. I've had the pleasure of dining there a few times since the reopening, and I can say with certainty that there's been a noticeable shift, not just in the atmosphere, but in the way your staff interacts with guests. You've done something rare. You've taken responsibility for your actions, learned from them, and created an environment where respect and kindness are at the forefront. I respect that more than you know. Keep doing what you're doing, Brad. It's making a difference. Best. Keanu Reeves. Brad sat back in his chair, staring at the letter in his hands. It was more than just a note of thanks. It was validation, confirmation that he was on the right path. Keanu had not just forgiven him. He had witnessed his transformation and acknowledged it. Brad smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt confident that the road ahead was one he could walk with integrity, humility, and purpose. Brad stood by the kitchen window of La Lumiere, watching the bustling streets of the city below. The restaurant had found its stride, the reviews continued to shine, and the atmosphere had become one of warmth and professionalism. But, as always, the true test came when the public attention faded, when the pressure to succeed began to feel like a distant memory. Could Brad continue to lead with the same heart, or would he slip back into old habits? The phone in his pocket buzzed, and Brad's hand instinctively reached for it. It was a text from Jessica. "Can you meet me at the cafe down the street in an hour? I need to talk." Brad furrowed his brow. Something in the tone of the message didn't sit right with him. He hadn't seen Jessica much in recent weeks. The two had been busy, both with the reopening and the growing success of La Lumiere. He quickly texted back, "Of course, I'll be there." As he made his way out of the restaurant and down the street, the warm, familiar air of the city surrounded him. He could see the people hustling in and out of shops, the laughter of children in the distance, and the street vendors calling out their wares. It was all so normal, but something inside Brad felt uneasy. He arrived at the cafe and spotted Jessica sitting in a corner booth, her usual vibrant demeanor replaced by an air of frustration. She looked up as he approached, her eyes tired and strained. "Hey," Brad said, sliding into the seat across from her. "What's going on?" Jessica's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then, she took a deep breath. "Brad, I think you should know that there's something going on with the restaurant," she said, her voice heavy. "Something's not right. People are starting to talk." Brad frowned. "Talk about what?" Jessica leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "There's been a string of complaints. Staff members are saying that things are slipping again. The quality's not where it should be. Some of the critics are noticing it. I hate to say this, but I think it's slipping back to what it used to be." Brad's heart sank. The possibility that he might be slipping back into his old ways hit him like a cold wave. "What do you mean? Are people upset? Is the food bad again?" Jessica shook her head, frustrated. "It's not the food. It's the atmosphere. The service. There's a lack of consistency. Some days it's great, but other days it's not. It's as if you're distracted, like you're not paying attention to what's really going on." Brad ran a hand through his hair, a deep sense of guilt washing over him. He'd worked so hard to turn La Lumiere around. He'd promised himself, promised the city, that it wouldn't be just another restaurant. Yet, here he was, hearing that things weren't as perfect as he'd hoped. "I don't know what to do, Brad," Jessica continued. "I can't keep this up. I think we need to reassess things before it gets any worse." Brad sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had to fix this. He knew that the success of La Lumiere wasn't just about good food and fancy decor. It was about creating a culture of care, consistency, and respect. He couldn't afford to let that slip. "I won't let it slip," he said, the words firm as they left his mouth. "I've worked too hard for this, and I'm not going back. I'm going to find out what's going on and fix it. This restaurant is more than just a business. It's who I am now. I've changed." Jessica gave him a sharp look, her eyes softening just slightly. "I hope you really mean that, Brad. You can't keep doing things half-heartedly. If you want La Lumiere to survive, it has to be more than just an image. It has to be real." "I get it," Brad replied, standing up. and I will fix it. I'm not going to let everything we've worked for go to waste. Thank you for telling me. I'll make it right." As the days passed, Brad threw himself into the task of turning things around at La Lumiere. He called a meeting with the entire staff and opened the floor to honest feedback. No more barriers. No more hierarchy. For the first time, he asked them to tell him everything. What was working, what wasn't, and how they felt about the restaurant's direction. The conversation that followed was eye-opening. The staff spoke candidly about feeling overworked, about the inconsistency in management, about moments where Brad seemed distracted or out of touch. It wasn't easy to hear, but Brad needed to hear it. He had fallen back into old habits, taking things for granted, assuming that the changes he had made were enough. That day, Brad promised himself that he would no longer be the manager who simply oversaw the restaurant. He would be a leader who listened, who adapted, and who kept the team at the heart of everything. He started working closely with his kitchen staff, organizing more training sessions, and implementing clear communication strategies to ensure that the standards of service and quality remained high. The weeks that followed were filled with challenges. The stress was high, and there were moments when Brad questioned if he had made the right decision. The restaurant wasn't perfect, no business was, but Brad was determined to make it the best it could be. With each passing day, the atmosphere began to shift again, this time for the better. Brad found himself reconnecting with the people who made La Lumiere tick, the servers, the chefs, the dishwashers. He spent more time on the floor, walking through the dining room, engaging with guests, and, most importantly, making sure his staff felt valued. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when Brad felt like giving up. But with each challenge, he realized something important. Leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up every day, being present, and making sure your actions matched your words. One night, about a month after the cafe meeting with Jessica, Brad looked around the restaurant. The energy was different this time. The staff were smiling, guests were laughing, and the reviews continued to be glowing. La Lumiere was truly back on track. As he stepped into the dining room, Keanu Reeves walked in again, this time with a small group of friends. Brad's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen Keanu since the reopening, and the sight of him now reminded Brad just how far he had come. Keanu's eyes met Brad's, and for a moment, they shared a knowing look. No words were needed. Keanu's presence in the restaurant that night wasn't just about the celebrity. It was a reminder of the journey Brad had been on. He had started with a mistake, a moment of arrogance, but it had led him to something much bigger. A chance to grow, to learn, and to build something that was more than just a restaurant. It was a place where people felt respected, where care and quality came first. Brad smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. He had learned that success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about staying grounded and continuing to evolve. As the months went by, La Lumiere continued to shine as a beacon of what true transformation could look like. Brad's journey was far from over, but he had found a new sense of purpose. Each day, he woke up with a renewed commitment to his team and his restaurant. He wasn't just managing a high-end eatery, he was creating a space where people felt seen, heard, and appreciated. The pressure of keeping up the restaurant's reputation was still there, but Brad had learned how to handle it. He had learned to trust his team, to delegate, and to focus on what truly mattered. The balance between perfection and imperfection had become part of the restaurant's DNA. They celebrated the small victories, and each mistake became an opportunity for growth. One evening, Brad was sitting in his office, looking over the latest financial reports when his phone rang. It was Jessica. "Hey, Brad," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "I've got some amazing news. Is everything okay?" Brad asked, sitting up straighter. "You're not going to believe it," Jessica said. "La Lumiere just got nominated for a Michelin star." Brad's heart skipped a beat. He had heard whispers of the possibility, but he'd always dismissed it. It seemed like such a distant dream, something that was far beyond his reach. But now, it was happening. "We've been nominated," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, we've made it to the final round. This is huge, Brad. You've done it. We've done it." Brad could hardly process the words. After everything, after the mistakes, the humility, the hard work, it was finally happening. La Lumiere had not only survived the toughest tests, it had thrived. And now, it was being recognized on a global scale. He thanked Jessica, his hands shaking slightly as he hung up the phone. He sat back in his chair, staring at the walls of his office, which now felt like a place of accomplishment and purpose. The road had been long, and at times, it had seemed impossible. But now, it felt like everything had come full circle. He thought back to the night when Keanu Reeves had walked into La Lumiere, and how that moment had changed everything for him. It wasn't just about the apology or the promise to do better. It was about understanding the deeper meaning of what he was doing. That night, as Brad walked through the restaurant's dining room, he couldn't help but smile. The lights twinkled above the tables, and the soft hum of conversation filled the air. Guests were enjoying their meals, and staff members moved fluidly, each one focused and efficient. The atmosphere was warm, comfortable, and welcoming. It was everything Brad had ever wanted La Lumiere to be. But even in this moment of triumph, he knew the journey didn't end here. The Michelin star nomination was just one milestone in a much bigger picture. It was a reminder that success wasn't just about the accolades or recognition. It was about the impact you had on the lives of those around you. The restaurant wasn't just about serving food. It was about creating memories, building relationships, and offering a space for people to feel respected and valued. As Brad made his way to the kitchen, he found himself reflecting on all the moments that had led him here. The tough conversations with his team, the late nights spent perfecting dishes, the hours he'd spent learning to be a better leader. It had all brought him to this point. And now, with the Michelin star nomination in hand, he knew that La Lumiere was truly a reflection of who he had become. He walked into the kitchen and was greeted with the familiar sight of his chefs at work. They were focused, determined, and proud of the work they did. Brad's heart swelled with pride for them, for what they had all accomplished together. But it wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about the people behind it. Brad's team had become more than just employees. They were a family. They had weathered the storm with him, supporting him through the ups and downs, the moments of doubt, and the celebrations of success. "All right, team," Brad called out, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "We've got some exciting news. La Lumiere has been nominated for a Michelin star." The room erupted into cheers, and Brad couldn't help but laugh. For a moment, it felt surreal. He had been so focused on getting things right, on making amends, and on finding his true purpose that this moment felt like the cherry on top of an already incredible journey. "We did it," Jessica said, walking up beside him. "All of us." Brad nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "We've come a long way. But this is just the beginning. We're not stopping now. We keep growing. We keep improving." Jessica smiled. "That's what I love about you, Brad. You've never lost sight of the bigger picture. And that's why we're here today." As the night went on, Brad watched his staff celebrate with quiet pride, each one reflecting on the journey they had all been a part of. It wasn't about the Michelin star anymore. That was just a symbol of the real transformation that had taken place at La Lumiere. Brad had come full circle, from a proud and arrogant manager to a humble, focused leader. He had learned that success wasn't measured by awards or recognition. It was measured by the impact you had on the people around you. And as he looked around the room at the people who had helped him get here, he knew that the true reward was the family they had built together. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of excitement and nervous anticipation. As the final Michelin evaluations took place, Brad and his team waited anxiously for the results. But no matter the outcome, Brad knew that their real success had already been achieved. They had built something far greater than just a restaurant. They had built a community, a space where people felt cared for and valued, a place where the experience went beyond the food. In the end, the Michelin star would be a footnote in the greater story of La Lumiere, a reminder of the hard work, humility, and growth that had come before it. And when the announcement finally came, it was clear. The real victory was in the journey itself.